The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Thank you very much. Well, I am younger than Bishop Spong. As we usually do, I'll try to cover most of this in the first hour, and then after the break, focus especially on questions. But if there's something you need immediate information on, just because it's preventing you from going any further, and you want to raise your hand, I'll take a quick question in the first hour. But basically, I'll try to make the presentation in the first hour. We're told that Jesus taught in parables. That's not surprising. This is the most common form of Jewish teaching. Actually, the Hebrew word mashal can be translated in several ways in English. It can be a parable or a proverb or an allegory, an anecdote. It's always based on a metaphor or a simile, and you remember from your high school English that that's some kind of a comparison. So it can be very short, like the book of Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible. It's that same word for parable. The lazy man turns on his bed like the squeaky hinge on the door. Okay? That would be kind of a short proverb, and you have a basic image there. The lazy man, the squeaky hinge. Or perhaps the most famous parable in the Hebrew Bible is the one of Nathan and David. King David has, as you recall probably the story, successfully completed his adulterous affair with Bathsheba. He tried to pin the blame of the pregnancy on her husband Uriah by calling him home on furloughs, but Uriah would sleep in the barracks. He wouldn't go to his wife during the furloughs. So then David sent a death notice with Uriah back into the campaign that he was fighting for David, and told the generals, send Uriah up to the front and pull the rest of the troops back. So Uriah was killed. So after a certain amount of time, then David took Bathsheba into his harem and felt that he had covered the tracks on this adultery and this murder. And then one day the prophet Nathan came to court and said that he wanted to tell David a story. And of course, David was interested in hearing a story, and Nathan said there was this rich man who had a wonderful farm filled with lambs and sheep and animals, but he had a neighbor who was very poor and just had one little lamb that he used to treat like a household pet. It sat on his lap, and he fed it by hand, etc. And one night, the rich man was having a big dinner, and he told his servants to go out and take that little lamb from the neighbor and slaughter it and serve it to his guests. At that point, David jumps out of his throne and sort of says, who could be such a scumbag? That's kind of close to the original Hebrew. And in one of the great lines of the Bible, Nathan points his bony finger at David and says, Atah ha'ish, you are the man. And David slumps into his throne, overwhelmed with a sense of guilt, realization of what he did. I mean, this shows us the effectiveness of the parable, because if Nathan had come and said, David, I want to talk to you about some moral problems that I see in your recent behavior, David, like most of us, would have gotten very defensive. But the thing about the parable is that it slips in like a little landmine that kind of explodes before David could prepare any defenses against it. And so once David had the insight, then it was too late to go back. And I think that's one of the ways the parable functions. For those of you familiar with Zen Buddhism, it's a little bit like the koan, one of those little thought-provoking reflections that pushes the mind beyond the rational. I think another great advantage of a parable is that it's not dogmatic. It doesn't tell you what to think. It gives you this little story, and then it challenges you to do the work on your own. So that most of Jesus' parables, he ends with a phrase like, let the ones who have ears hear. Let the ones who have eyes see. Meaning, take this home, think about it, and maybe it will explode with meaning at some point in your life. Now, there have been an awful lot of books written about the parables, and what would make this different, this book that I've been writing. One thing that makes it different is I do like very much the Gospel of Thomas, this gospel that was discovered just some 50 years ago. And I believe with other scholars that parts of the Gospel of Thomas predate what we have in the New Testament in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. So where there's a version of the parable in Thomas, I use that version. And that is one thing that I think makes this a little different. So we'll see as we go along. As in other of my books, I put the parable on one side, the text on one side, and then the little commentary on the other. So let's start with one that's in the Gospel of Thomas. A thoughtful fisherman threw his net into the sea and pulled it out full of fish. And among all the little fish, that thoughtful fisherman found one fine large fish that would be beneficial to him. So throwing all the little fish back into the sea, he chose to keep the large one. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Okay? So this would have been a common scene around the Sea of Galilee where Jesus lived and taught during his 3 years of his public life. So fishermen throwing a net out, pulling in a bunch of fish. Now these were the days before refrigeration and so on, and so what the fellow was looking for was really a fish that would serve as a dinner for himself and his family. And having found that, he threw the others back and took that large fish home for dinner. But what's the parable all about? Okay. Actually, the theme of this parable, I discovered, was one of the most common themes in Jesus' parables. And what it's about at one level is discernment. Okay. Which is the biggest fish? What's the big fish in our net? And what are the little fish? What's the big fish in our lives? And what are the little fish? I did this as a series at a church recently, and the second Sunday of the series, this couple came in, and the guy said, you know, I've been thinking all week about what the big fish is. And his wife said, honey, it's me. No more need to think about that parable. You can move on. See, but what is the big fish? It addresses the question of value, which was something Jesus talked about a lot. A value is a very difficult thing to define. It's that on the basis of which we make choices. So all day long, we're operating on values. So you're all here tonight because of a choice. And in every case, the choice is informed by a value. But in many cases, you might not have even thought about the value, especially if it's become habitual for you. I always say no one has time to do things. You make time to do things. So you made time to be here tonight, or those of you in our virtual reality are making time to tune in. Well, why? You have other things to do. You had other possible things to do. Well, at some level, you were sifting through values. Education is a value. So is entertainment. So is taking a nap. Okay? And at some point, on the basis of a value, you made a choice. Now, I think that's what the big fish is about. We're going to see it in a lot of the parables. Jesus uses a lot of metaphors about this, because this is essentially what wisdom is about. Wisdom is not the same as bits of knowledge. It's not the same as information. Wisdom is a coordinating view. It's putting things into a certain order. And you put them in order around what you see as a primary value in your life. The great theologian, Paul Tillich, talked about an ultimate concern. He said, we have an ultimate concern. And Tillich said, in order to find that, you ask yourself something like, why are you here tonight? Well, because I like educational programs. And why do you like educational programs? And you keep going through this sort of self-examination until you are sort of in a corner. You've like painted yourself in a corner. And you can't answer any more questions. You've reached the final, the ultimate. So Tillich would say at that point, turn around and kneel down, you've found your God. Okay? Your ultimate concern is your God. And that's why Muslims pray 5 times a day, you know. There is no God but God. Why do they need this reminder? Because 10 minutes later they might, like all of us, be thinking money is God, fame is God, prestige is God, There are a lot of other candidates out there for the God slot, for the ultimate concern slot. And so 5 times a day the Muslim says, there is no God but God, reminding oneself of God. Rabbi Heschel said, God is either of supreme importance or of no importance. In other words, God is either the supreme value or, if you want to fit God in somewhere between tennis and volleyball, it doesn't work. So a very important question in life is, what's the big fish? What's the big fish? All right, we'll move on. But we're going to come back to that idea of the big fish. This is a parable that's in the Gospels, and it's also in Thomas. It's a little different in Thomas, but not much different. In some ways, I think this is perhaps the most important parable at one level. A man went out to sow seed, and in that environment, they just had a little bag of seed, and around these little peasant homes, Jesus was talking to these peasants. They just scattered some seed around. It wasn't very professional or developed farming. The richer people who had larger agricultural enterprises had more efficient farming, but the peasants pretty much just threw seed around to see what grew. He filled his hand with seed and threw it about. Some fell on the road and birds ate it. Some fell on rocks and could neither root nor produce grain. Some fell into patches of thorny weeds that kept it from growing, and grubs ate it. But some fell in good soil and grew and produced good grain, 60 units per measure and 120 units per measure. So what's this one all about? See, what strikes me here is that many of the variables are the same. The seed is all good. We're to understand that the seed is all good. There's not some bad seed, some good seed. It's a good seed. The sun is the same. The rain is the same. The weather is the same. The variable is, of course, the soil, the receptivity of the soil. Now, this is consonant with one of the basic teachings in spirituality. As most of you know, I don't come to this field as a New Testament scholar. My expertise is really in comparative religions. That's my basic training. So that tends to be the approach I take to other things I investigate. So I look for convergences. This is something you're talking about in terms of the Theosophical Society. You're looking for kind of a perennial wisdom, a shared wisdom that you find in different places. And what we find pretty much all over the place is that the opening door to any kind of spiritual life is receptivity. If we're not receptive, then nothing else matters. Okay? Nothing else matters. So the Buddhists tell the story of this vain king who had a Buddhist teacher in to sort of show him off. And the teacher arrived, and the king asked him to do the ceremonial tea and pour the tea. And so the Buddhist teacher poured the tea. There was the cups on this lacquered tray, on this table, on this beautiful carpet. And the Buddhist teacher starts to pour the tea into the king's cup and keeps pouring. And all of a sudden the cup is overflowing. It's going onto the tray. And the king says, "Stop," he says, "my cup is full." And the Buddhist teacher bows and leaves the court. His point was made. The king's cup was full. The king was filled with his own ego, his own arrogance. A full cup can't receive tea. A full mind can't receive teachings. It doesn't make any difference who the teacher is. It doesn't make any difference how wise the teachings are. If there's no receptivity, then nothing happens. So what we have control of is not the sun or the rain or the seed. We are the soil. We have control over what kind of soil we are. Filled with weeds or rocks, whatever, or receptive. And so here again, it's not like there's one answer, but it gives us something to ponder. See, I wrote this book with 40 parables, thinking of it as kind of a 40-day journey. For Christians, it could be an appropriate Lenten book. But my idea was not to read more than one parable a day. So what we're doing tonight is different from the way I would suggest using this kind of a study. Just take one a day and let it sort of marinate. Let it sit in your mind and see if at some point it may explode with meaning for you. As I said, it's one of the great benefits of the parable. No one's telling you what to believe. It's not a dogma that someone's shoving down your throat. Jesus is simply saying, here's a story, ponder it, see where it takes you. See where it takes you. So we're kind of going at a higher speed here in order to look at some of these parables and get an idea of them. But if you're doing it on your own, I would say perhaps do it the other way. Here are a couple of parables that we find in Thomas that we don't see elsewhere. Jesus is saying, I have thrown fire on the world. Look, I am waiting for it to blaze. And then following that is another parable that's similar. Whoever is near to me is near the fire. Whoever is far from me is far from the kingdom. Now here we have the word that Jesus most uses in his parables, the word for kingdom or reign, the reign of God, the kingdom of God. This is one of the most disputed terms in Christian theology. And yet it's one of the most common. Christians pray every day, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done. What are Christians praying for? When I ask my students, a lot of them say, the end of the world. Well, do you want the world to end before you graduate? I mean, it's strange sometimes when people realize they've been praying for something for 50 years and have no idea what they're praying for. Now, the way I understand this, and this is where New Testament scholars kind of split. Okay? One group thinks that Jesus was waiting for the intervention of God to set up some sort of earthly kingdom. Okay? And the other believes that Jesus was talking about the present moment and a growth in one sense of consciousness. Okay? Now, I'm inclined to the latter view for several reasons. Again, as a student of comparative religions, I would say the great spiritual teachers are always teaching about the present moment. The secondary spiritual teachers are teaching about other things. So if I were to believe that Jesus was really talking about some kingdom being set up on earth by God, then I'd have to rank him among secondary teachers. But I don't think he was a secondary teacher. So I think he was talking about the present moment. So when I pray, thy kingdom come, I'm talking about something right now. I'm talking about something today. John Dominic Crossan says, one view is waiting for God to do something. So when you say thy kingdom come, you're waiting for God to do something, for God to intervene and change the world in some way. So the other view, God is waiting for you to do something. And again, I'm for that latter interpretation. Thy kingdom come, meaning, what am I doing to open myself to this higher consciousness? Now again, all the religions talk about this. In Hinduism, you have the Mahatma, like Gandhi. That wasn't his name, it was a title. Mahatma, Atman, is yourself. Maha is big. So a Mahatma is a big self. Buddhists talk about the big self. In Jewish mysticism, you have a consciousness that is gadlut, big. In Christianity, Paul's term is the mind of Christ. Paul says, put on the mind of Christ. That means big mind, as opposed to little mind, ego mind, narrow mind. Like Buddha mind, mind of Christ, big mind. See? So I think that's what the kingdom is about. It's big mind. From big mind comes big conscience. Conscience follows consciousness. When we think about the world in a larger way, we act in the world in a larger way. And from consciousness and conscience comes community. a deeper sense of community. So now we go back to Jesus saying, I've thrown fire on the world, and I'm waiting for it to blaze. And then in the other saying, who's ever near me is near fire, and who's ever far from me is far from the kingdom. Well, it looks like the basic metaphor is the kingdom is a fire. And Jesus embodies that fire. He is both spreading the fire, and he is the fire. He's both messenger and message. But why fire? Fire is dangerous. Right? And yet, when we look in the Bible, we see things like the Holy Spirit on Pentecost in the book of Acts coming like tongues of fire onto the apostles. So fire is also heat and warmth and energy, as well as potential danger. So what is Jesus spreading on the earth? What is he waiting to see it spread? Perhaps consciousness. This higher, deeper consciousness, leading to a deeper way of living and behaving in the world, leading to deeper kinds of communities in the world. And that perhaps is the coming of the kingdom. So that's what he sees in himself. And if we're near Jesus, we're near that fire. And if we're far from Jesus, we're far from the fire. Now, he isn't the only embodiment of that fire. But at least for those people he was talking to, and for people who understand God in terms of the teachings of Jesus, he would represent that fire. And he would be the spreader of that fire. Now, here's a place where the disciples explicitly ask Jesus for a simile. They say, tell us what the kingdom of heaven is like. And that's what a simile is. Something is like something else. Okay? And Jesus says, it's like a mustard seed, the smallest of all the seeds. But when it falls into cultivated soil, it sends out a large stem and becomes a shelter for the birds of heaven. That's just kind of an unexpected answer. Usually in the Bible, when you want to talk about impressive greenery, the Bible talks about the cedars of Lebanon. Okay? These beautiful cedars of Lebanon. But a mustard seed is a very ordinary, homely kind of plant that everybody had. It grew in everybody's backyard. And people don't usually point to it as a thing of great beauty. Was Jesus saying in a way that this kingdom was not only for some kind of priestly elite, but was really just for ordinary people? Seems to me that might be the case. Notice again, we have to have cultivated soil. There has to be receptive soil. So the reign of God is like this little seed that falls into cultivated soil. We're the soil. We're always the soil. And then it grows, and it becomes large enough that birds can find shelter in it. Now, it's interesting to me that, artists don't waste words, and Jesus is a master of poetic language. He could have just said birds, but he says birds of heaven. Now, I tend to see in the parables of Jesus language about height as being language about consciousness. Height is one of our ways of making a metaphor out of consciousness. Like in the great mystical traditions, when the great saints go through the levels of heaven, the 3 levels of heaven, the 7 levels of heaven, as they approach the throne of God. I think these are levels of consciousness, moving higher and higher to mystical consciousness. So the birds of heaven. So the reign of God is something that grows in us, in any one of us, in ordinary us, and becomes a shelter for the birds of heaven. Now, the birds of heaven is something I wrestle with here. It seems to me there are different ways to go with the birds of heaven. One would be to see birds of heaven as other like-minded people. In other words, as our consciousness grows, we attract people of higher consciousness who want to form community with us. I think that's a possible understanding. Or birds of heaven could be higher thoughts, higher inspirations. Or birds of heaven could be higher actions, that is to say, moral actions that are more encompassing. I'm not sure. Maybe all of those can be correct. Here again is where parables often manifest this kind of ambiguity. I don't think they pin themselves down to necessarily one and only one interpretation. So we're kind of left to ponder what that might be. Now, we have about 3 parables that have to do with thieves breaking into houses. These peasant homes weren't hard to break into, and there was a lot of poverty at this time. So there probably was a lot of petty thievery. Now, I think these parables, these 3 parables, really could have been one parable. And each time Jesus taught it, he just taught it, with a little different twist to it. But we find all of these in the Gospel of Thomas. This is, to me, if I could give you one piece of evidence why I think the Gospel of Thomas is earlier than the Gospels in the New Testament, we find this parable of the thief in the New Testament Gospels. But who is the thief in the New Testament Gospels? This parable appears in Matthew 24, Luke 12. Paul has it in 1 Thessalonians. It's in the second letter of Peter, and it's in the book of Revelation. So we see this parable all over the New Testament. But in every case, who is the thief? Anybody know from hearing these parables in church? I'll read the parable. If a householder knows that the thief is coming, he'll keep watch and not let him break into his house and steal his goods. You must keep on the lookout for blank. I'm going to leave that blank until later. Preparing yourselves so that thieves will not find any way to get in. Now, in the New Testament Gospels, we're told, watch out for the thief. Paul says, watch out for the thief. What is the thief in the Gospel stories? Anybody remember from all those years in church?
Could be your gold mine. That sounds like Eckhart Tolle number. Could it possibly be that?
That's a good answer, but it's not what's in the New Testament. What's in the New Testament? It's Jesus returning, the glorious return of Jesus, his parousia. And I've always felt uncomfortable with that because, number one, it's not a good metaphor. Jesus is like a thief. Yeah. Number two, I can't imagine Jesus going around talking about his second coming. So I've always had trouble with that parable. In Thomas, it says, keep on the lookout for the world, for worldliness. This is not the world of the flowers and the grass and the birds. It's the world, it's worldliness. It's our obsessive attachment to the goods of the world. The world is good. The things of the world are good. The pleasures of the world are good. But when we're obsessively attached to them, then they, instead of us, using them as part of our openness to God and to the service of our fellow human beings, they become the focus of our attention. They become our gods. So in these 3 parables, Jesus says, watch out for this thief, and the thief is worldliness. That worldliness would restrict our consciousness and not allow us to have that larger consciousness of the kingdom. When I first read that in Thomas, I said, this makes sense. This is what Jesus would have said. Whereas the thief being Jesus returning never made any sense to me. Now notice how close these are. In this first one, we're to watch out for the thief who's coming. So we're to be on the lookout. In the second one, it's a little different. It's not possible for a thief to enter a strong man's house and take it over forcefully unless he first ties his hands. Then he can steal. Now we're not just watching out for a thief. We're watching out for a thief who's going to try to tie our hands. What would it mean to tie our hands? Right? If we're talking about consciousness overflowing into conscience, if in Christian language consciousness is the mind of Christ, then consciousness would be the hands of Christ. If our hands are tied, if we stop our volunteer work, the efforts we make to help others, our social outreach, how long will it be before our consciousness will shrivel up? See, consciousness and conscience have to go together. It's like the fruit on the tree. When Jesus says, you know a tree by its fruit. If someone is bragging about their apple tree, but it's never had apples, then it's not much of an apple tree. So consciousness is going to be translated into conscience. The mind of Christ is going to be translated into the actions of the hands of Christ. So if worldliness ties our hands, convinces us that we don't have time to help others, then it won't be long before the consciousness will disappear as well. The third one. And as I said, I think this may be one story that Jesus told, but perhaps each time with a little different emphasis. Blessed is the one who knows when the thieves are going to attack, so he can prepare and assemble his forces and arm himself before the bandits enter. Now here we get the picture of a little bit more of an aggressive attack by more than one, and here the emphasis is on arming ourselves. So the first one is just being alert, being awake. The second one is watching out that our hands don't get tied. And the third one is actually preparing ourselves. Now, of course, this made me think of St. Paul. In his letter to the Ephesians, Paul says, put on the belt of truth. Put on the breastplate of God-centeredness. Put on the shield of faith. Put on the helmet of healing and wholeness. So Paul gives us a whole wardrobe of defense. Put on the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Well, with these qualities, we would certainly be well armed. So each of these stories is about worldliness trying to take away from us higher consciousness. And we're urged to be prepared. We're urged to continue to do what we can do. To the great commandment, Leviticus 19:13, love your neighbor as yourself. We're encouraged to reach out to others, to help others. And we're encouraged to sort of put on the armor that can defend us from these attacks. Okay, I want to do a couple more here on the image of height. A city built and fortified on a tall hill can't easily be taken, nor can it be hidden. Okay? City on the hill. That metaphor goes into our language. It's how, our founding fathers saw this country. City on the hill. What is the hill? Right? Jerusalem is a city on a hill. You always go up to Jerusalem. I don't think Jesus is talking about physical height. As I say, one of my principles of interpretation is that height means higher consciousness. So a city on a tall hill, to me, would be a community built on a higher consciousness. That we have to be aware. Just like individuals have a consciousness, so do groups. I remember shortly after 9/11, I heard the great Jewish teacher Elie Wiesel speak at a synagogue in Chicago. And he said, as you wrestle with terrorism, he said, be aware of the greatest danger that threatens you, he said. The greatest danger is that you become terrorists in opposing terrorists. Okay? That you'll lose your high ground. Okay? And descend to the level of the enemy who's attacking you. So here's an injunction to be a city on a hill. Now, here's another, I think, obvious example that this is metaphorical. Jesus says, what you hear in your ears, preach from your housetops. Now, I don't think the most literal of fundamentalists would not imagine that Jesus wanted us to climb up on our roofs. So what does it mean to say, whatever you hear, preach it from your housetop? I would say, interpret it at the highest level of consciousness. Take it to the housetop. Go up, go up. Go to that higher consciousness. Because in a sense, all the problems in our world are problems of consciousness. As many of you have heard me say, I don't think many people get up in the morning with the idea of doing bad things. I think most people act out of their level of consciousness. But if they have a very tribal, egotistical, undeveloped consciousness, then they do very bad things. So like this Christian militant group that was caught in Michigan a few days ago, who sort of see the current administration as the Antichrist and feel that in order to promote God's cause in the world, which is a nation of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they need to kill everybody else. Are they acting evilly? Were they acting evilly in their plot to kill a number of policemen? No. They were acting consistently with the way they saw the world. But the way they saw the world was very narrow, very tribal. And consequently, their actions were very harmful, or would have been very harmful if they hadn't been caught. See, the words attributed to Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. I think if Jesus said that, he meant it. These Roman soldiers who were nailing people to a cross weren't really aware of what they were doing. They were acting at a very low level of consciousness where human beings were no different than nailing together two pieces of wood. See? So it's very important where our consciousness is. Everything hinges on that. All our actions flow from that. So the higher our consciousness, if we move from tribal to rational, from rational to psychic, where we feel the other side, from psychic perhaps to mystical, as our consciousness opens up, our conscience will open up. Our actions will be different in the world. So if those folks in Michigan sitting in the prison cells can reflect, and if their consciousness could open up, and they could come to feel that there are human beings who aren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, then they wouldn't want to act that way in the world. Their conscience would change. So that's why I think Jesus says, go to the housetop. Always go to the higher level of consciousness. It's like, take a deep breath, We're motivated to act tribally. Someone cuts us off on the highway or something. Take a deep breath, Try to move to a rational consciousness. Okay? And take another deep breath. Try to move to psychic consciousness. Try to be aware of what others are feeling. And take another deep breath. Try to reach a kind of mystical consciousness where the other is you. Mystical consciousness is unity consciousness. Okay? That person and I are really one. We're all images of God. We're all manifestations of the same divine reality. Now, it's not that this is easy, but it's a real practice. It's a real concrete practice to go to our housetops. Okay? I often speak about consciousness as a house. We can be in the basement, that's the tribal, or the first floor, that's the rational, or the psychic, that's the second floor, or the roof garden, that's the mystical. I think this is, pragmatic. And then the next teaching is, you don't light a lamp, and put it under a bowl. You put it on a lampstand, so that all who go in and out may see the light. Okay? So again, as we grow in consciousness, put that on a lampstand. Let it translate itself into action, into a way of being in the world, so that everyone who goes in and out can see that light. All right? that to me is the direction it's going. Now, here's another one of those, it's kind of a puzzling parable, and a lot of the people who copied it changed it, because Jesus says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your body will be full of darkness. But if the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Now, a lot of the copyists, because these were all hand-copied documents, said, oh, wait a minute, people have two eyes. So they made it eyes. But then it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't follow that if your eyes are healthy, your whole body is healthy. You could have 20/20 vision and be dying of cancer. It only makes sense if we understand this as the third eye, the eye of wisdom. Like in the chakra system in India, this is that chakra of wisdom. If that eye is healthy, then the whole body is healthy. So now we're back to the big fish in a different metaphor here. Right? Because that eye of wisdom is the one that tells us what is most important. And then everything else falls in place in terms of that. So you can only have one thing that is of most importance. That's why we have the teaching of Jesus, you can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and money. Jesus doesn't say you can't serve God and have money. He says you can't serve God and serve money. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says you can't ride two horses. See? Can't ride two horses. It seems to me that in Jesus' wisdom teaching, the single most important thing he wants us to ask ourselves is, what is primary? What's our greatest concern? What's our biggest fish? What's our treasure? And once we're really clear about that, then everything else kind of falls into place. But if we're not clear about that, I'm doing some research this summer on the letter of James, a little letter in the New Testament, and James uses a word that I like. It's called, in the Greek, it's dipsukoi, which psukoi, it's our word psyche, and the di is two. Dipsukoi, James says, don't be dipsukoi. Don't be two-minded. Okay? Don't be two-minded. That's like riding two horses. Try to get clarity about what's most important to you, and then the other stuff falls into place. Okay? Try to have clarity about what the big fish is that you want to bring home. And then the other stuff will fall into place. So, here we have that same theme, the big fish. This is a parable that people are familiar with from the New Testament. The kingdom of the Father is like a merchant with goods to sell who found a pearl. The merchant was thoughtful. He sold the merchandise and bought the pearl. This again has entered our language as an idiom, the pearl of great price. Okay. What, if you're a business person and you buy and sell, okay, what kind of item would it be that would lead you to sell all your merchandise to buy? Okay. What kind of pearl would it have to be to lead you to sell all your inventory to buy? Okay. That's our big fish. Okay. That's our big concern. That's our God. In the pragmatic sense, that's our God. Now, interestingly enough, we can also lose it. And let's see, we got a little time here, so let me go into two parables. Time for two more. One, from the New Testament. The kingdom is like a woman who took a little leaven or yeast and concealed it in dough. She made large loaves of bread. He who has ears, let him hear. Now there's something magic. As a kid, I lived in a two-flat. My aunt downstairs used to make bread, and I'd go down, and there'd be that table, that bowl in the middle of the table with a towel over it, and she'd say, "Don't jump around now. The bread is rising." And as I'd go in and out, I'd see it just rising. It's kind of like magic, right? Okay. So Jesus says, It's like a woman who took yeast, but the verb is odd here. It says concealed it in dough. Not just kneaded it into the dough or mixed it with the dough, but concealed it. And she ends up making large loaves of bread. What is that yeast that we can put into the dough of life? It's the kingdom. Are we the yeast? How do we put that yeast in? I mean, these are some of the things we got to think about. One last parable. This is one that's not in the New Testament. It's only in Thomas. And it's interesting because it is a parable about losing the kingdom. Most of these parables are about what the kingdom is and how we get it. So it's like the mustard seed that's growing. It's like the yeast in the bread. But here's one about losing it. I think it's a fascinating parable. The kingdom is like a woman carrying a jar full of grain. Now we know from artifacts of this time that a lot of these big ceramic jars, women carried upside down on their shoulder. And a little spigot was on the bottom. Apparently, this little spigot had loosened. As she walked along, a handle of her jar broke off, and grain trickled out. But she didn't notice. And when she arrived in her house, she put the jar down and found it empty. This is the first parable of this kind. Okay. Presumably, the grain would be the kingdom. The grain would be the higher consciousness. Now, we have been warned that thieves can get at that higher consciousness by tying our hands, by making us think we really don't have time to help our neighbor. So thieves can get at that consciousness. But we can also lose the consciousness not through an outside agency, but through carelessness. I think the telling line here is, she didn't notice. And it's very tragic. She gets home and the jar is empty. Okay. Can we start out with perhaps a very large consciousness and a very dedicated conscience? And then, as the days turn into months and the months turn into years, it just kind of gradually slips away. I mean, we get tied up with all the things that life puts on our plate, paying bills and doing this and doing that. And then as we come near the end, we sort of look and it's all gone. It's lying somewhere there along the road of our life. And it's just all, without her even noticing it, it all just slipped away. It all slipped away. Okay. So, well, we actually have time for one more. This is terrible, though. We should be stopping and thinking about each of these, and instead I'm sort of plunging you into all of them. But we will have time after the break to go back to any of these. This is in the New Testament, but it's different here. So I'm going to ask those of you who have heard this in church to tell me how it's different. The kingdom is like a man with a treasure of which he is unaware, hidden in the field. You've all heard of that if you've ever been to church. Treasure in the field. But notice, in the New Testament, it's just one guy and a treasure. He kind of stumbles upon it, and he goes out and sells everything and buys the field. It's kind of like the pearl of great price. Notice how this parable is different. So the guy with the treasure in the field, he doesn't know about the treasure, he dies, and he leaves the field to his son. His son doesn't know anything about the treasure, and having received the field, sold it. So now we've had two owners, the original one who died, the son who sold it. The new owner came. Now we have a third guy. The new owner came, and while plowing, found the treasure. Now what's different in this parable? Parables sometimes hinge on little details. How does the guy find a treasure in the gospel story, in the one that's in the New Testament?
He was working the land.
Pardon?
The last one was working the land.
In Thomas, but in the New Testament version, he just kind of, stubs his toe on a treasure and digs it up and it's there. But you're right, in this parable, The original owner never plows the field. His son never plows the field. Son just says, oh, I inherited this field. Let me get some quick money. I'll sell it. Son never plows the field. The third owner, while plowing the field, finds the treasure. So what's different in this version of the parable is it suggests spiritual practice. That we have to find the treasure, we have to plow the field a little bit. We need to use the methods of spiritual discernment, meditation, and silence, sacred texts, all the things that help us to be open to what's in the field, and then find the treasure. Fascinating things now, and as I say, there are 40 of these, and imagine, just taking one a day and letting it sort of play in your mind for a day and seeing where it takes you. Nobody's telling you where it has to take you. But if our eyes are open and our ears are open, it will take us somewhere. It'll take us somewhere. Somewhere, I think, very personal in our individual spiritual journeys. So we'll take our break, and then we have plenty of time to come back to any of these parables you'd like to revisit or any other kind of questions that you have about them. Okay?
If you could compare some of the parables of Jesus to the parables of the Buddha.
Yes,
which you did, one right off the bat, before you got the question.
There's a book you can get, edited by Marcus Borg, that has a teaching of Jesus on one side and a teaching of the Buddha on the facing page. So, that little book exists, and you can see any number of those. The Buddha has a parable of a mustard seed, but it's a different parable. It's about a mustard seed, but it's a different parable. But a lot of what the Buddha would say has to do with that higher consciousness. Like his Sermon of the Flower once, he just held up a flower, and this one disciple just sort of moved into that higher state of consciousness, just like by the side of the flower. So it's like anything can trigger that. And I think that's where the parable serves as a sort of a springboard. Like with David, it just pushed David to a higher level of awareness from where he was stuck. But I definitely recommend that book.
Ron, could you address the extent to which you are aware that the Gospel of Thomas, being, I agree, one of the earliest, is being now picked up within the Christian community to use more definitively than maybe some of the other Gospels?
Well, the response to the Gospel of Thomas is based on the geography of the Christian community. If I had a chalkboard or something, I would draw like a spectrum, okay? And in the middle is the dogma of biblical inerrancy. That's that the Bible is true in every respect. Now, on one side of that lives evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity. They will not touch the Gospel of Thomas because it isn't in the Bible, and therefore it is not gifted with inerrancy. On the other side of that continental divide lives the mainline and the liberal churches. And they are very open to the Gospel of Thomas. The Jesus Seminar even includes it. There's a book you can get called The Five Gospels. And they put Thomas with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So all the interest in the Gospel of Thomas lives on this side of biblical inerrancy. And on that side of biblical inerrancy, there's not a willingness to touch it. So that's an unfortunate split.
As you were talking about in the beginning about the idea of discernment and what's really, really important, and the parable that popped into my head was the parable of the virgins, whoever they were, waiting for the bridegroom.
Right.
And it's always been kind of a confusing parable to me. And I wondered, does that fit into this? I mean, it seems a little bit like there's something about that somebody didn't focus on what was truly important.
Right.
But Can you
I don't
take
know
that
if I
apart
can,
a little bit, or does that?
put my
Does that
finger
even
on that
fit?
parable right now. I know I have it in here in some places, but one thing I would say is the basic idea is there's a wedding about to take place, and they're waiting for the bridegroom. And so some of the wedding party are there, and they have their lamps, and they're awake, and they're ready to go into the wedding feast, and they have oil in their lamps. And then you have others who are waiting who didn't bother to get oil for their lamps. And they turn to those who have them and say, we don't have any oil in our lamps, can you give us yours? And they can't, or they don't. And the bridegroom comes, and the ones with oil in their lamps go in, and the others are left out. Now, at one level, it seems like sort of uncharitable behavior on the part of the ones who have the oil. But, and I think I first read this in Cynthia Bourgeau, who's an Episcopal priest. She runs a retreat center in Canada. I like her books very much. I think she's very insightful. And I think it was from her that I heard this insight that they can't share the oil, because the oil is this consciousness. You see, if you or I were to go to the Dalai Lama and say, give us your consciousness, he couldn't do it. I mean, not because he's stingy, he just can't do it. He could give us ways to stimulate and grow our consciousness, but he couldn't give us a higher consciousness. And in that sense, those who enter the wedding feast, those who are able to go into this new kind of community, have to have oil in their lamps. And no one else can give you their oil, because it's something you have to have from your own spiritual growth, your own spiritual development. So that's the way I've come to make some sense of that parable. But I've always found that a difficult parable too. But Cynthia Bourgeau helped me with that one.
Doesn't it also fit with what you were talking about before, how Jesus was saying, I'll send my fire to the earth, and in order to really have something light, you have to have something combustible, which
Yeah.
might be the oil. So it kind of almost goes with the other parable, that for us to be lit, we have to have that oil.
Yes, I mean, I think spirituality really has to come to grips with something that got off track in the Reformation. And that was sort of a ridiculous argument about whether it's faith that saves us or works. And that, I think, a lot of pages of ink were wasted on that. And John Dominic Crossan says, look, there's faith works, faith-works, and there's law works, law-works. Law works would be, doing something for some extraneous motive, to be seen by other people, or, because you think it's an obligation or something like that. Faith works are works that are done out of trust in God. And his point is, you got to keep the two together. And so for a long time, especially in certain Protestant circles, there was a suspicion of monastic practices and so on. Because, these are works. This is claiming that you're saved by works. No, I mean, faith leads to works. Faith and works go together, and these are okay. So I would think of the parables of Jesus, if you look at that guy plowing the field, if you look at other examples, we need to do spiritual work. We need to do spiritual practice. That doesn't contradict our trust in the divine reality. It's part of trusting the divine reality.
Ron, you said something earlier tonight that really intrigued me. You mentioned that the consensus now is that the Gospel of Thomas was written before the Synoptic Gospel?
Well, a consensus among one group of scholars. Another group of scholars sees it as late. If I could give tonight one single argument why I think parts of Thomas, not all of Thomas, there are 114 sayings in Thomas. I think some of them are later. But I think there's a substantial part of Thomas that is earlier. And if I could give one, I think, convincing, sound argument, it's the parable of the thief in the night. I just don't think that the New Testament understanding of the thief in the night as Jesus returning makes sense. Whereas I think the Thomas version, where the thief in the night is worldliness, makes eminent sense. And that alone would convince me that the parable Jesus told was about worldliness, not about his return.
So in your opinion, is it possible that Thomas was actually written by the Apostle Thomas? And was it written before the...
Probably not by the Apostle Thomas. I mean, names were more... in the ancient world, a name is more of a kind of an attribution, not a literal authorship. But I would say Thomas, the scholars would say Thomas was probably written in the 50s, the same time Paul was writing. So that would be among the earliest. And then let's say Mark written around in the 70s, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, John in the 90s. So that would mean that the core of Thomas may well have been written in the 50s. And now another thing Crossan did that is interesting, he put Thomas together with what scholars call the Q text, which is common material in Luke and Matthew. And it's generally thought that the Q text is from around the 50s and was used by Matthew and Luke. And when you put Q together with Thomas, they have 37 sayings in common. So and Crossan thinks that that indicates an oral tradition from the 40s. Now, Jesus was crucified in 30. So if we're talking about oral tradition from the 40s, we're very close to the period in which Jesus was teaching. So I do think Thomas gets us, not all of Thomas, but I think a substantial part of Thomas gets us pretty darn close to Jesus' teachings. I mean, I feel all of us working in this field talk about the voice of Jesus, wanting to hear the voice of Jesus. And in Thomas, I feel I hear the voice of Jesus pretty loud and clear.
Do we have any other questions? Well,
We always have more parables.
yeah.
You know, I sort of dump them on you in this. Usually, when I do this in a, in a context at a church or someplace, we do it over a period of weeks and then sort of discuss each one as they come along. So, are there any of those we've taken you'd like to revisit, or we can go look at another one?
When the peasant was throwing the seeds on the ground, don't you think he'd look for like areas that were more fertile and just like the
Yeah.
teacher looks for more
Right.
fertile students?
Well,
or-
this is a funny thing about a parable, or I suppose any metaphor. There's a Latin motto, omne analogium claudat, every analogy limps. When you try to understand a metaphor, you look for the point of comparison, and you ignore the rest. So for instance, if you say, the Lord is my shepherd in the psalm. Well, I mean, shepherds were smelly and dirty, so does that mean God is smelly and dirty? No. So what's the point of the comparison? Well, the shepherd guides and leads. So an interesting thing about a parable is you can't pull out every detail and make it consistent. For instance, in the parable about the woman losing the grain, well, in one workshop, a woman said to me, well, that grain was sort of going into the soil and nourishing the soil. So maybe Jesus was praising the woman who lost the grain along the way. I don't think so, because the parable says explicitly she wasn't paying attention. Okay? So this is the tricky part of a parable. You have to find, it's kind of like a joke, you have to find exactly where it hits. And then don't pay too much attention to some of the other circumstances. So Charlie would be right. I mean, I think the parable even says, or maybe it doesn't, but that the guy is sort of careless. I mean, he's rushing off to do whatever he has to do. He's got a little seed, and he better get it in the ground soon. Rain's coming, and he throws it around. He's not doing a very good job of farming. But that probably isn't the point of the parable. The point of the parable is to have different kinds of soil. So parables are tricky. What to pay attention to, what not to pay attention to, what to focus on, what not to focus on. As I said, the birds of heaven that sit in the branches of the tree, what are those darn birds? Are they thoughts? Are they people? I don't know. But, Jesus put that detail in there, so it's got to mean something,
You think it's possible the birds of heaven, this is something which people couldn't understand 2,000 years ago, but a lot of people into the New Age movement would say maybe it's ascended masters people can be in contact with, or your higher self, which somebody like a Neil Walsh contacted, or anybody,
Yeah.
any kind of psychics can contact.
I think so. I mean, I think if the kingdom of God is growing in us and we attract birds of heaven, maybe that should be kept as open as possible. It can mean people who seek our companionship. It could mean books that suddenly seem to come our way. It could mean teachings. I think it's very well capable of meaning what you're talking about. I think it's a very open term. But it's a significant detail.
Ron, I'd like to have you expound a little more on the big fish and the discernment. That's very, very insightful.
Well, I'll tell you, the clearest place, I think, where we see it is in Matthew's gospel, where Jesus says explicitly, seek first the kingdom of God, and everything else will be given to you. See, that seems to me to be very clear. Get your priorities straight, and everything else falls into place. I'll tell you the other place where it's taught, and we didn't get to this, is when Jesus talks about where your treasure is, there is your heart. And the teaching of Jesus, don't put your treasure where moths consume, where rust can destroy, or where thieves can steal. So when I go through this with students, I always say, okay, what can moths get to? Well, there's your cashmere sweater or whatever. What can rust get to? Well, there's your Mercedes. Okay? What can thieves get to? Everything, even your identity can be stolen. So what's left when you get rid of the thieves, the moths, and the rust? What's left? Totally, internal stuff. Friendships, love, wisdom, knowledge, your relationship to God. Okay? And then Jesus says, where your treasure is, there is your heart. See, I think that's the same as the fish. It's like, where is your treasure? Right? Where is your treasure? That's where your heart will be. So if our treasure is money, then our heart's there. If our treasure is popularity, our heart's there. If our treasure is prestige, our heart's there. And that's why I think the single most important thing is where the priority is. But this can't just be a thought. It's got to be real. So there was this anthropologist who did a study of student life on a campus. He didn't just ask students, because if you ask students, how do you spend your time? Well, I study 8 hours a day, I do this, I do that. He lived in the dorm. He was a young-looking doctoral student, and he actually lived in an undergrad dorm and started watching how students were spending their time. The greatest amount of time was spent not in partying, but in something that's very important in one's psychological development during those late adolescent years, and it's what students just think of as hanging around. Somebody comes by your room, another person stops by, and pretty soon, 4 hours have gone by. That's a very important part of life at that stage of adolescence, just hanging around. Students almost never mentioned it because it's not something they focused on. See? I mean, they knew what it was to sit down and study. They knew what it was to go out and party. They knew what it was to sleep or eat. So sometimes we're not transparent to ourselves. Like they'll do surveys of older adults and say, what music do you listen to? Oh, I listen to classical music. I always listen to classical music. And then when you say, okay, well, let's break it down. Let's go through today. And you find out they weren't listening to classical music. I mean, that's what they thought they were supposed to say. So when we're looking for our ultimate concern, it's not what we think it should be, it's what it actually is. How do we find out? We got to go back and evaluate choices. We got to go back to choices. And as I said, most of the time, our values are transparent. I mean, if you're a person who consistently likes adult education, then you're just going to choose it. And you're not going to think about it. You're not going to say, oh, I'm missing this tonight to do that, or I'm missing that. You're just going to choose it, because that's your habitual value, you see? So we have to go back and look at choices and say, what value was primary in this choice that I made? It takes a little soul searching to see whether the values of the teachers, the spiritual teachers, like Jesus, when he was asked of all the commandments, and the rabbis had counted 613 mitzvot in the Torah, of all these commandments, which are most important? And Jesus chose Deuteronomy 6, love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. Thomas Merton always called these the three loves: to love God, to love yourself, and to love your neighbor. Well, then we ask ourselves, as I look back at today, did I love God? Did I love myself? Did I love my neighbor? We can't just do this in the abstract. We actually have to see the way we made choices and the way we make choices. That's where we find out what our values are. That's where we find out what the big fish is.
We have another question from cyberspace. What do you think the New Testament thief parable means?
Which parable?
The thief parable?
Well, again, in the New Testament, it means Jesus returning, the second coming of Jesus. But in Thomas, there are 3 thief parables, and they're all about worldliness. Worldliness would be the opposite of what Christians would call the mind of Christ, or the opposite of what Buddhists would call the Buddha mind. So worldliness, as I said, is an obsessive relationship to the goods of the world, so that the goods of the world interfere with our pursuit of higher goals and higher consciousness. But in the New Testament, in every instance, the thief is Jesus returning, the day of the Lord, Jesus' second coming. And I can't imagine Jesus telling a parable about his second coming, because I don't believe in any kind of a literal second coming. To me, when a person is transformed in his or her consciousness, conscience, sense of community, that's how Jesus returns. And so when our planetary evolution has reached a more spiritual level, I mean, when we move more, now we're mostly tribal. Most of our politics, most of what goes on in the world is tribal. When we move from the tribal to the rational to the psychic and eventually to the mystic, that to me would be the return of Jesus, or the return of the Buddha, or the return of the 7th Imam or the 12th Imam in Shia Islam. That would be the return of Amitabha Buddha. I mean, all of these metaphors would be fulfilled by the spiritual evolution of humankind, when we're operating with the mind of Christ, with the Buddha mind, with the Mahatma mind. See, when we're operating that way as a human community, then Jesus has returned, you see. So I don't look to somebody coming on a cloud. There's a great line in the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus says, if the kingdom of God is somebody coming on a cloud, then the birds are going to see it first. And if the kingdom of God is something coming in the sea, the fish are going to see it. And Jesus says, the kingdom of God is all around you, but not many people see it. See, this goes back to that idea that if you have eyes to see. That's why I wrote a line in another of my books that said, a miracle is not an unusual event. It's an event to which we pay unusual attention. See, for the great holy people, every moment is a miracle. The opposite of spiritual mindedness is taking for grantedness. That's the real killer, I think. You know, we all woke up this morning and perhaps we just took it for granted. What else do we expect? See? Whereas I think for the spiritually advanced, every moment has a miracle quality. This is what I see in people that I see as holy, like the Dalai Lama. You know, whenever I'm around the Dalai Lama, it's like everything that happens, someone gives a cup of tea, you know, his eyebrows go up. Oh, you know, it's like the Dalai Lama, every moment is unwrapping Christmas presents or something. Every moment is like this wonderful miracle, see? And I find this every year when I take folks to the Gethsemane where Thomas Merton lived for 27 years, where they're Trappist monks. And I find this with the monks, you see, they'll take you around and say, oh, let's stop, look at that tree, you know? Or let's listen to the sound of that bell. Well, they don't have to go to Disney World to get a kick, you know? Or ride some kind of roller coaster. Just looking at a tree, hearing a bell, feeling water. You know, these very simple things are miraculous. They're miraculous. And I think that's what spiritual growth is really about.
But I know Christ used the word watch a lot. That might have something akin to that.
Yes.
I had a comment that came up from something that you just said, but then I had a question too. When you were talking about fire, I may be being too liberal and crossing traditions here, but in Hinduism, fire is transformation. It's in virtually every sacrament.
Yeah.
So Christ coming and saying that he's the transformation and the transformer seem to...
That's interesting. Especially, I'm just finishing a book, you know, when Christ lived in India, and that whole tradition that those 30 years, he wasn't just, you know, out there working in the carpenter shop the whole time. Like the third eye. I mean, there are interesting teachings. Although we do know that Hindus and Buddhists were on the Silk Road, coming down there through where the Dead Sea Scrolls were, where Qumran was, just, you know, not that far from Jerusalem. So Jews could have been in contact with Hindu and Buddhist thought. But that's interesting about fire as a means of transformation.
Okay, and the question was, I'm wondering if you could expound on the parable of the three servants and what the talents were. And
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's one that's in this book or not. But you know the story. The master goes off on the trip, and he leaves property with each of these three servants. And when he comes back, the first one has done something with it, and he praises him for that. And the second one has done something, and he praises. The third one says, well, I knew you were a pretty fearful master, so I just buried what you gave me, and here it is. You know, it's safe and intact. And the master is not happy. And I think here again, it's this call for us to grow with what we've been given. That consciousness overflows into conscience. It's this business of get up on the rooftops. It's this business of let your light be seen. It's a business of this is not given to you just to hold in the secrecy of your own heart, but what transforms us should be transformative of the way we live and act in the world. And that's how these things become contagious. That's how they happen. Not so much through words, but through deeds. You know, one of the great Christians in history was Francis of Assisi, great 13th century saint who worked with the poor in Italy. And many people feel that he perhaps had the mind of Christ more than any other. And he told the poor friars who worked with him, he said, as they went out to work with the poor, he said, preach the gospel all day long. He said, once in a while, you'll need words. Meaning that it's not done primarily through words. And this, I think, is the great challenge to institutional religion. I mean, I think it's why some people turn away. I mean, look at the turmoil of the Roman Catholic Church at this time. The words aren't making much difference right now. See? The scandal runs deeper than words. And people are looking for more than words. You know, the televangelist who gives the good sermon and then takes all the money to build a new swimming pool. You know, this doesn't go over too well. Or the minister in Colorado Springs who's inveighing against gay people and so on, and then is betraying his own wife and family and doing crystal meth and having sex with a male prostitute every week, you know? It's like, what are people doing? I mean, that's where the spiritual message is delivered, not just in the words.